President Obama's 2015 task force on 21st century policing recommended essentially the same suite of reforms as McGuckin did in 1943. That was 72 years ago. I think the time has come to stop talking about reforming the police. The institution cannot be reformed. It was built to do exactly what it does. The system is not broken, but rather is working very, very well. And the cycles of abuse, rebellion, analysis, reform, and then renewed legitimacy continue, while police continue to be the tip of the spear against poor, black, brown, and queer communities and organized labor. So tonight I hope we can begin imagining how to create a world beyond policing.
So I picked up this book, fairly new, The Black and the Blue, that I sort of was aware of but hadn't had a chance to look at. It's written by a former, lifetime law enforcement officer, African American, who is, a commentator on law enforcement for CNN and other networks, and he lays bare, if you will, the kind of racism built into American policing. So he describes a bunch of, horrific. I woke up at 3:30 this morning, so I had some time to go through it. Jet lag allowed that. So, but the problem is that the solution he lays out is that, we need better screening of police officers. We need more diverse police officers. We need enhanced training for police officers for the purpose of restoring trust in the policing. So I'll just give you a little preview here. I'm not going to urge you to trust the police. What I do want to do is talk about a little bit about why these reforms are actually part of the problem, not the solution. So I'll start with a little story. So I got a call a while back from a reporter, as I do often in New York, about a city council hearing that was planned. About 6 months before this, a middle-aged African-American woman living in public housing named Deborah Danner had a mental health crisis, and her neighbor saw that she was in distress and called 911 to try to get help for her, and what she got was an armed police response. They forced entry into her apartment, forced entry into her bedroom, and after a struggle where the details are in dispute, she was shot to death by the sergeant in charge, even though he had a taser, even though he had had specialized training, and even though she was in her own home. So the city council saw that this was an injustice and said, well, we have to do something about this. So what was their big idea about what to do? Well, the reporter was calling me because the purpose of the hearing was to discuss whether or not the police department was getting the right training for mental health calls and whether or not this training was being implemented quickly enough. So the reporter wanted my assessment of the, is this the right training? Should they be getting a different training? So I started thinking about the CIT training and the Memphis model, and I stopped myself and I stopped the reporter and I say, I'm not really interested ultimately in fine-tuning the police response to these calls. I'm interested in ending it. The fact is that between 1/4 and half of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And if we want to reduce that carnage, training is not the solution. We've been doing training, a lot of different kind of training regimes, and we have research that shows that it just does not work. It does not change the arrest rates. It does not change use of force rates. The few studies that show some positive impact are in those cities where the training has been combined with a dramatic expansion in community-based mental health resources, to which the obvious response is, let's build community-based mental health resources so that we don't need a police response, because that's what's generating the better outcomes. So why is it that our very progressive city council in New York City can only see the problem as one of police training? And I think there are a couple of explanations for this. One is a kind of legal formalism that is very popular among liberals who are at root conflict averse and ultimately want the system to work properly in their mind. That we just need to fine-tune it a little bit. So they believe that the problem of policing is a problem of execution, of implementation. That if we could just get the police to follow the legal frameworks and procedures properly, that we wouldn't have so many killings, people wouldn't be so upset, and the police could get back to doing what we want them to do, which is making everyone safe in this narrative. But of course, this is a gross misunderstanding of the nature of the legal frameworks that we've asked police to enforce. The liberal reformers, the legal formalists, believe that the law is inherently beneficial to everyone. That if we could just get everyone to follow the rules, that this will create a kind of level, neutral playing field that will allow civilization to flourish. But the law has never functioned primarily in this way. The law has always been a tool for the reproduction of inequalities and the enabling of regimes of exploitation. There's a famous 19th century saying that the law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, begging in the streets, and stealing bread. But of course, the rich don't need to do these things. The totally neutral professional enforcement of those laws, by their very nature, reproduces inequality. In this case, along lines of class. But of course, in the US, it's very hard to disentangle race and class. And so this always has a racial character, in part because we've developed a society that links race and class together. And we can see this very clearly in the war on drugs. We hear this idea that, well, if we could just get the war on drugs to be less racially disparate, that somehow this would achieve some level of justice. But the war on drugs has never been about producing public safety or public health, and certainly has had nothing to do with justice. A totally lawful, professionally executed, unbiased drug arrest is still going to ruin some young person's life for no damn good reason. We've had this war on drugs for close to 50 years, longer if we go back to, opium, prohibition, etc., but in the modern form. And drugs are cheaper, higher quality, and easier to get than they've ever been. We got overdoses through the roof because it was never about that. Now we know. We actually have, detailed statements from folks like in the Nixon White House saying that this is about the criminalization of political enemies and a rancid politics of race designed to get white voters in the South to switch from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party by signaling that the Republicans were going to be tough on those people, and that drugs was an entryway into that kind of politics. Nixon's own public health advisors were for safe injection facilities and needle exchange, legalized prescription heroin. They had actually some very good recommendations, far better than those of the Obama administration or the Clinton administration, ironically. But they were all overruled by this rancid racial politics. So what's the other reason that our well-meaning city council misunderstands this issue? Well, part of it is a deep commitment or capitulation to austerity politics. They've given up the idea that government, the state, can engage in positive redistributive interventions that actually help people. And once they've given up that possibility, the tool that's left available to them to address very real problems of safety and health is the criminal justice system. So that the idea of a massive expansion of public health services, a massive expansion of public housing, a massive improvement in public schools is no longer even conceivable to most of these people, because we've lived through this 40-year period of there is no alternative. So once they cut themselves off from any kinds of positive market interventions or major expansions of social programs, they frame the problem of one of criminal justice. And this is incredibly appealing to the elites that played a huge role in ushering in this austerity. Because they want to define our social problems as ones of individual or group moral failure that will only respond to punitive and coercive interventions. Why? Because the alternative would be to acknowledge that these are problems of market failures, of the fundamental nature of the economic system, of regimes of exploitation. And that is the last thing that they want to acknowledge or empower, those kinds of interventions. So they must always talk about the moral failings of the people that they are criminalizing. And that means more money into policing and more money into jails and more saying, oh, we don't have any money to fix the schools. We don't have any money. But there's always money to hire new police officers, to build a new youth detention facility, to rehab a jail. There's always money for that. Because it doesn't challenge any of the dominant political frameworks within which they are operating. So this legal formalism is not limited to, treating the mental health crisis of our society as a training issue. It gets expressed in a lot of different ways, including in this book and in some of the commissions that Aaron talked about. One of my favorites, anti-favorites, is implicit bias training. How many people are familiar with this concept in some form? Right, because it's all the vogue now. When a police department gets caught with its pants down doing something racist emails, killing unarmed black people, whatever, hugely disproportionate, arrest statistics, they say, oh, my bad, but don't worry, we got it covered. We're going to, for $5 million, we're going to bring in some training firm and we're going to give the officers implicit bias training. So implicit bias training, is based on this idea that we all carry unconscious stereotypes about people that may influence our behavior in some way. But the research that this is based on is actually pretty thin and problematic. Yes, obviously we all carry stereotypes, we all have unconscious motivations, but it's very hard to find a linkage between that and individualized behavior, and the research has not been able to do that. But really there's a much bigger problem, which is that this assumes that the problems of race and policing are at the level of individual officer discretionary decision making. And that if we could just adjust that officer's attitude through some kind of training, that this would reduce the number of horrible killings, people would feel better about the police, and the police could get back to waging their war on drugs and war on crime and war on gangs and war on immigrants and war on disorder and, war on terror and et cetera, et cetera. it's incredibly popular precisely because it allows these police departments and mayors to say they're doing something in a way that no one's at fault, no one did anything intentionally wrong, and it can all be easily fixed through a technocratic intervention. And we know how much Americans love technocratic solutions to their problems. The problems of race and policing are not problems of individual officer unconscious discretion. First of all, we got a problem of explicit racism in American policing. There is nothing implicit about the statements coming out of the Fraternal Order of Police and these other police unions. There is nothing implicit about the chat rooms and the emails that we find. There's nothing implicit about the LA sheriff's deputies with the racist tattoos, who are tied to white supremacist movements. That is straight up explicit racism. And no amount of getting them to sit in some classroom while some person gets up and lectures about the history of slavery is going to fix that. But even that does not get to the full nature of the problem. Because even if we could weed out the racist officers, even if we made policing more diverse, the racism is built into the mission. What we've done is that we've decided as a society that the problems of poor and mostly non-white people are to be solved through people with guns and handcuffs. And even when that is done in a professional and unbiased manner at the level of individuals, it reproduces racial inequality. I did an event at an elite school in Manhattan, and there were a couple of us on the panel, including Miriam Kaba, and she's like, you all already have police abolition. Because if those kids do something, nobody's calling the police. Oh, Jimmy, what is this we found in your locker? What are you doing? Come, give that to me. I'm going to just take this and put it in a drawer, and let's not, and then you can do some detention maybe, right? Why don't they call the police? Because their parents know that no good can come from their kid being involved in any way in the criminal justice system. They know that. They don't want the police anywhere near their families. But we've decided for poor black and brown communities that they cannot have a second chance, that they cannot have access to real services, that they cannot have adequate counselors in their schools. They get policing, handcuffs, guns, incarceration. And that is racist. It is not the neutral application of the law designed to benefit everyone equally. That is the embracing of a logic that says that some people are inferior and do not deserve the kinds of things that we know would make their lives and their communities better. And this is really at the root of my beef about community policing. So there was a piece in the paper here this week about celebrating this pilot community policing project here in Portland, and everyone's so excited about how nice the police are now and how they're solving all our problems. And Kristian, as was mentioned earlier, has done great work on this. But community policing at root is about getting the community to bring the police all their problems so that the police can come up with a solution. Tell us where the bad guys are, where's the drug house, who are the shooters, right? So it's intelligence gathering. And then the police are supposed to go out and solve the problem. But what tools do the police have to solve our community problems? They've got guns and ticket books and handcuffs, and these are not the tools to solve the problems in our communities. They don't have access to mental health services. They don't have access to affordable housing. They don't have access to drug treatment. If they do, it's in this punitive individual responsibility model that is always backed up by the threat of incarceration if you don't follow the program rules. We got policing on demand in every part of the country, and we've got drug treatment on demand nowhere. We don't have high quality drug treatment on demand anywhere in this country. But we've decided that for folks who don't have money, what they get is policing. But people persist in this idea that if we could just get the police to be nicer and friendlier and more professional and less biased, that we could restore trust in policing. There was a recent report issued by some very, well-off academics at Yale and other places who are in this procedural justice movement. A lot of them tied to the Obama Department of Justice. And their whole thing is we have to restore public trust in the police so that police can get back to doing their job. How do we do that? By getting them to do implicit bias training so they're not so racist on the job, to get them to have community police conversations. Well, Aaron's work in LA shows what nonsense that is. When the police have a dialogue with someone, they decide who they're having a dialogue with, what the dialogue is about, where the dialogue takes place, what the outcomes of the conversation are going to be. This is about constructing a public for the police. It is not about creating real limits to police power. Because if it was about that, they wouldn't do it. And anybody who goes to these police community meetings and raises those kinds of issues is immediately ostracized, pushed out, ignored. So please, do not waste any more of your time going to these police meetings thinking that you're holding them accountable by pointing out their shortcomings. Because they did not invent the war on drugs. They did not invent austerity politics. They may support it politically. They may be an impediment to what we're doing through their unions, etc. But they did not invent these things, and they cannot fix these things. And I often say this book is about political accountability much more than it is about police accountability. We have let these politicians off the hook by channeling all our energy into yelling at the police. But these police meetings, the police commission meetings and the hearings, are designed precisely to take all that anger and all that community energy and dissipate it into nothingness. Because they don't have the power to give us anything that we actually need. They can give us a new training thing. They can agree to some further community dialogue. That's what the police commission here that came out of the federal DOJ intervention, they love, let's have another set of community members in dialogue with us. Because that does not threaten them at all. That further empowers them. What we have to do is we have to look at those politicians who, when someone gets killed, they come out on the picket line with us, right? And then they go back to the city council meeting and vote to hire more police. Vote to expand the jail. Those people are not our friends. Because every time they do that, they both reduce the resources that are available for us to make the kinds of positive interventions that need to be made. But maybe just as importantly, they reinforce the ideology that says that the way to solve problems in poor communities is to mobilize the criminal justice system. And as long as that logic is allowed to go unchallenged, we're never going to be able to win the kinds of things that we really want. We have to go to those politicians and say, why can't we have drug treatment on demand? Why can't we have robust harm reduction programs? Why can't we get some damn supportive housing to do something about the severe homelessness crisis here that is responsible for half the arrests and half the use of force incidents by the Portland Police Department? And no amount of training is going to fix that if there is no housing for people. And part of the reason the city does not have enough money to build housing is because they spend it on policing. So the animating mission of this project has really been to try to share with people the pessimism that comes from 20 plus years studying police, the pessimism that we're going to fix them. I have spent too many hours in the back of police cars in meetings with community members and police executives and reading reports and studying the history to believe that any of this procedural nonsense is going to make any meaningful difference. It just isn't. There's no research to back it up. It's about politics, about appearing to do something so they can get back to business as usual. And our job is not to let them get away with that. Thank you.